Hey y'all, how are you doing? I'm great. Thank you so much for asking. It's me, Kim, and I'm back for another video. Today, I brought some people on to talk about Afro-Latinx identity. I have some concerns, I have some thoughts, and I wanted to talk to people who, know what they're talking about. So if y'all would introduce yourselves.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. My name is Janelle Martinez. I am a multimedia journalist of Garifuna descent, which is an Afro-Indigenous group across Central America. And I also identify as a Black Latina, and I have a platform called Ain't a Latina where I celebrate and highlight the Black Latina experience.
And hi, thank you so much for having us, Kim. My name is Natasha Alford. I am a journalist, multimedia journalist focused on video. Currently work for thegrio.com, and I am Afro-Latina. I can go into my background a little bit more later, but African-American and Puerto Rican.
I wanted to talk about Afro-Latinx identity because everybody knows I love trash. I watch a lot of reality TV. And I don't know, do you watch Basketball Wives? Yeah,
I do. I haven't watched it as of late, but I know I know where we're going with this.
You know where we're going. You know where we're going. Okay, so Evelyn Lozada has been on Basketball Wives for the past, 15 years. I don't know, for however long. And recently, she on Twitter got called out for using the N-word, right? And so she replied back to somebody saying something to the effect of, I can use it, I'm Black. Okay? And I was like, oh, really? Oh, you're Black now. Okay. But then I was like, oh, is that a problematic thought? I think I felt resentful because it feels like I am resentful of people who can jump into Blackness whenever they want to, opt in, and then maybe when they don't want to anymore can opt out. And I just want to know if that resentment is valid.
I would say that it is valid, and I also want to highlight the fact that that's not just valid amongst someone that identifies as Black American. As someone that identifies as Black from a Latin American, descendancy, we too feel that same thing.
Great.
Right? I think in terms of even when you talk about Afro-Latinx identity, amongst us as a people, we've in the last couple years have been like, oh, people are now coming to the forefront because they see a commercial or a financial opportunity to push this identity forward versus people that have constantly lived this experience, both, in people's respective countries and in the United States. So it's valid, and it's not just something signature to the Black American experience. Black Latinxes feel the same.
Okay, great.
Yeah, no, I'm co-signing everything Janelle says. I mean, within the Afro-Latinx community, we literally are having these same debates about who gets to jump in, who gets to say, I have a Black great-grandmother 4 generations ago. But, I'm a little, I guess, resentful, too, of the fact that reality TV is the way that this conversation has come to the mainstream because, we obviously have the most, I think the energy is negative, right? It's Evelyn, it's OG, they're fighting, they're going back and forth versus, having a conversation about movements that have existed for a long time and people who have existed as Black. Janelle and I, we're Black. We have their whole communities that have existed as Black for years, and some of them have been proud to be Black from the day that they were born, and some are actually just learning because they have existed in a space of colonialism and oppression, even within their own communities. And so Evelyn is an example, but I hope that this just opens the door for us to talk about the people who really get it.
All right, so Janelle, you mentioned the resentment that you have toward people who might just one day just jump in. And I do think that there's a conversation there about what in the Black American context is called the onedrop rule. And I'm just wondering, in the Afro-Latinx context, what are the boundaries? Is there a way to determine what the boundaries of Blackness are?
I have to take a deep breath because I think that is really... So for one, in Latin America, the onedrop rule, I wouldn't say it applies in the same sense.
Okay.
Right? I think that there are people that, similar to what Natasha mentioned, like maybe 4 generations back have had a Black, you know, grandmother, right? Who may acknowledge that ancestry. So they will maybe use the term like Afro-descendant, which is acknowledging that ancestry, but not necessarily saying that their lived experience is that of a visibly Black person, which hence the term like Afro-Latinx, Afro-Latina, Afro-Latino. Now it gets blurry because in certain spaces, for example, in Latin America, there's numerous terms for Black. You know, there's negra, trigueña, morena, jabao, like all these different terms, right? But we're saying Black. And then furthermore, there's no escaping Blackness, right?
Especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, where that African influence is in everything, whether people want to own it or not.
Exactly. And I think people, and again, that's where the conversation even comes up today with the music, right? Like people are, in our community, are mad at that, like when you see some of the awards given out, like it's not visibly Black people that are collecting those awards. So I know this is like a lot. There's just so many different things at play, but I will say that one drop rule is not exactly the same. However, when you are living a life and in the body of a visibly Black person, you're definitely going to experience life differently than someone that is in Latin America considered mestizo, right? Or like mixed race, right? You still have the closer you get to whiteness, right? You're gonna get different opportunities, or people will digest you in a specific way. But obviously, the further you are from that, your lived experience is different. And so I think what is interesting too is, I know that like this is a conversation we have in our community, is like for Afro-Latinx people, many of us who are, you know, people will understand, or they'll look at like Zoe Saldana and they'll be like, is she not really? But then there is a Zoe Kravitz, or there is you know, Tracee Ellis Ross, right? And so I think no matter the land that we're speaking to, identity can get really messy. And I think that even though we are defining some of these ideologies and these terms, we're still working through some of these things as well. But I do think that there's been frameworks set, not just now in like this visible conversation, but like decades ago.
And I wanted to jump in on the one drop rule. So I'm doing a story right now about the census in Puerto Rico and how people identify. And there was a rule that came from the Spanish colony called Gracias al Sacar, where you could actually opt out of Blackness if you could prove that you had a white ancestor in the 4 generations.
That's interesting.
So it was like a reverse one drop rule, right? So there was incentives and, you know, this alignment between Puerto Rico and the U.S. to whiten the population. And you actually saw between 1910 and 1920 that on the census, the population got whiter. So there was, again, this colonialism and this imperialism that tried to drag people away from their Blackness and gave like actual incentives for being whiter. And so you'll find that, you know, there's a movement now, and this will be in a story that's coming out that I'm writing for the New York Times, about a movement of Black Latinos who are campaigning to get people to pick Black on the census. And we have to think about, when we say Black, there is a history in that, even with African Americans. And so I come at this from an intersectional experience because I'm multi-ethnic. I'm African American and I'm Puerto Rican. Even in the Black community, saying Black wasn't always an accepted thing.
Totally.
It's a terminology that in the 1970s, during the Black Power and the Black arts movement, you know, radicals were like, we are Black and we should be proud of that. And there was a whole community that was like, actually, I'm more comfortable being colored, or more comfortable being Negro. So these are all terms that are evolving. And in the Latin American community, they too, you know, Blackness for many is a new thing, because that's just not the terms that they use. They use the terms that Janelle said, I'm morena, I'm, you know, trigueña. And the idea of nationality and ethnicity supersedes everything. So I'm Puerto Rican above everything. I'm Dominican above everything. We don't have those race problems. But what that does, it erases the racism that Afro-Latinos face in those communities as well. And it allows people to distance themselves from Blackness by saying, well, I'm Puerto Rican. I'm not Black. I'm not white. I'm not anything. So it's messy. It's complicated.
Yeah. This is an emerging movement that you're writing about right now.
The census movement is one that started around 2000 when the majority of Puerto Ricans identified as white on the census. And so there was a group then the Black population in Puerto Rico started to organize. And in 2010, they saw a slight drop down to 76% that identified as white. And so they're continuing this campaign for 2020 to get more people to identify as Black.
As somebody who is outside of the Afro-Latinx community, it does feel like the visibility of Afro-Latinx people talking about their identities, it's more on my radar now. And I know that this stuff has been going up. People have been talking about this for a long time. But why am I now so tuned into these conversations? Has something about that changed?
That's a great question.
That is.
I think technology is huge, right? So and this is for a lot of marginalized communities where Instagram has allowed people to tell their own stories, or social media in general. And so there were Black Latinos who were like, I'm never on the People Espanol Beautiful 100 list. You know, you talk about Latin Heritage Month and you never show a picture of someone that looks like me. And so they started to create their own brands, you know, Anti-Latina right here, you know, Afro-Latinas, Blacktina. And that created a conversation in which we could now cross these borders and educate. But there's a flip side, and that's capitalism and the idea that Afro-Latinx is now a marketing term. So you can throw it on a t-shirt, you can, I'm Afro-Latinx now. And there's, you know, you can have conferences or whatever it may be, and then people can make money off of this. And so that kind of picks up on what Janelle was saying. So I'll let you finish that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I feel like technology is definitely the key driver of this conversation. But it is important to know, as you mentioned, like these conversations have gone on for decades. And also there's people in our communities that have always been unapologetically Black and proud of that. Why I think at, let's say, 2017, 2018, we were seeing like an uptick is that simply social media, right? Twitter, this notion that you can hashtag and have searchable, you know, terms on these platforms, Instagram for sure. I would even say like Tumblr, because early days of Tumblr, like you would be able to see like a Bad Dominicana or some of these other folks. Literally, that was like the main place online that you would begin to see these images of and discussions around empowerment of Afro-Latinx folks. Also, we have to note reality TV, Amara La Negra with Love and Hip Hop Miami. I think I was super shocked to see how many people were like, what is this term? This is a made up term. And there's a whole lot that went into that conversation that bubbled up after, you know, the first episode.
But it seems like I was seeing Latinx people say, like I on the Breakfast Club, I heard Fat Joe say, well, they just came up with that, and I was like, oh, that's interesting.
But Fat Joe can look at how Fat Joe like appears and interacts. You know what I'm saying, in his body and his lived experience. Like he can easily say that, and I do think that there are a lot of like white and mixed race Latinxes that will sit here and say like, well, in our countries, I mean, well, you operate and you move through the spaces differently. Like you can say, oh yeah, there aren't any Black folks here, but 2 blocks down where all of us have no choice but to reside and live, you don't have to walk through there, right?
Okay, and but can I just talk about why I get a little bit confused? Because then Fat Joe will be on a public platform, a large public platform, and say, well, they just made that up. And then he'll say, but I'm Black. But I'm Black. And then so I'm sitting there like, okay, well, but you just said that you didn't, okay. And so it feels like, here's what it feels like for me. It feels like now that Black culture is more visible than it's ever been. It's more profitable than it's ever been. It's being mainstreamed in a different kind of way. Like, there's more money in it. It feels to me sometimes like people jump into the I'm Black because Black folks are like, we care about cultural appropriation. We're calling people out on it. We care about cultural appropriation. We're calling people out on it. We're making sure that you know that you fucked up. And so in order to eschew some of that backlash, folks who maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe wouldn't have claimed a Black identity or an Afro-Latinx identity are saying, well, I'm that now.
I think when I saw that video, I thought his was an oversimplification of acknowledging your ancestry, right? He just he completely oversimplified it. Oh, Latinos are Black. And it goes into this myth of Latinos are made of Spanish, indigenous people, and African. And we're all just this one mix. No, there are different types of Latinos. There are white Latinos. There are Black Latinos, mestizo. We could run the gamut. And so, but I do think there is a rightful claim to say that in Latino culture, specifically for Fat Joe, someone like Puerto Rico, every aspect of Puerto Rican culture is influenced by Africa. The music, the food, the dancing.
He wasn't wrong.
Right. And so he just, again, oversimplification.
I agree. And I think he doesn't have the terminology.
Yeah.
And many of us don't, or are still working through. And I also think it's important because Fat Joe is from the Bronx. I'm born and raised, still reside in the Bronx. And from conversations, because even comparing how I grew up to other folks that grew up in the Midwest or other areas, it was, and it's not right, but it was very much so acceptable for anyone that grew up in the hood or an urban area, whether you were white Latinx, as long as you were not white American, to use the N-word or to feel this level of ownership over Black culture. Now, Fat Joe, what is he in his 40s, etc.? I don't know. But I think he very much so is still coming to the table with that notion of I am adjacent to Blackness. And yes, even in my own culture, we have, it is Black, but I'm not I'm not Black at all. And I don't move in that way. And so that's not for me to have ownership over. I don't think he fully understands that. And I also think the platform that he was on, The Breakfast Club, who was going to challenge
no one.
Come with the
Nobody.
information to,
I co-sign everything. Region means a lot, right? Because out in LA, right, when you talk about Latinos and Blacks, there's a very different understanding of what that is. And most people will think Mexican and Black, and there are actually some tensions there versus if you're living in a place like Chicago or New York where, Blacks and Puerto Rican, African Americans. So let me be very clear when I say Black, because I'm African American, so we say Black folk,
right.
But African Americans and groups like Puerto Ricans grew up side by side and, making hip hop and so there was all this interaction and feeling of oh, it's okay. So I think geography is huge in terms of the way people understand it.
Absolutely.
You brought up something that I think is important. An important part of this conversation is something that I've been trying to think through is oftentimes when we talk about Black folks, make sweeping generalizations about Black folks, my default is Black American identity. I'm generally always just thinking about Black American folks, people who have a lot of similar references and frames, and really, if we really dive down into it, descendants of enslaved people. And so do you feel like sometimes that our conversations about Blackness are not adequately acknowledging that Blackness is vast? And so that muddies up our discussions of Black identity.
Well, you and I went to the same college, and I didn't really understand that there were Africans, Caribbean, and I am African American and Puerto Rican. That was my first interaction going to a predominantly white institution in the Northeast, where I was like, wow, there are all different types of Black people.
Totally.
And we got into these huge debates about who was entitled to be there and who was benefiting from the suffering and the trauma that African descendants of slaves, endured, and the access and all of that.
And that's still going. Those discussions are still happening.
And they're still happening.
Yeah.
So I would say that our discussion, we tend to paint with a broad brush. And even in my evolution, I used to just say I'm Black because I was tired of trying to convince people I was also Latina. So I was like, I'm not trying to prove nothing to you. I'm just Black. That's what it is, right? But in studying this, I went searching for my own identity and did my thesis on a Black Puerto Rican reggaeton artist. And I was like, oh, wow, there are Black Latinos, and I have a rightful claim to that. I shouldn't try to erase that. But it's because when we say Black in the United States, we think African American. And that's also why I think a lot of Afro-Latinos don't say Black, because they feel that it refers to African American ethnicity and culture, and they're therefore erasing their unique cultural identity.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I think that, for one, even when we talk about Blackness, I think people automatically, because of where we are, will assume African American. And we don't necessarily look at like the diaspora. I also think too, when we talk about, yes, we're speaking of North America, but many people don't even think about Central America.
Absolutely.
And as someone that, that's where my descendancy comes from, even in the context of Latinidad and amongst other things, it completely gets like wiped out of the conversation. South America, all of that identity, I feel like should be factored in. And I also sometimes think that like when we have these conversations, because it's so visible, we look like maybe 10, 20 years ago as like reference points. But I always think about like, for example, Black Panther movement in support of the Young Lords, right? And like when I think about Marcus Garvey and like, so we've always had Schomburg. We've always had a global, or at least I feel like our elders and ancestors had a global perspective of Blackness. And I oftentimes find myself reflecting on where was the disconnect and where has the disconnect been, and how do we then bridge those gaps? Because at the end of the day, whether we're talking about Harlem or, City Boya in Honduras, or we're talking about some spot in Colombia, like we're as Black people going through very similar experiences. And so what is it going to take for us to recognize that? I mean, because really what us not doing that is the byproduct of colonization and that work continuing on and colonialism.
Okay, so here's another controversial topic we're about to wade into. Are you familiar with this ADOS movement?
I'm very familiar.
Okay.
Working at thegrio.com.
Okay, so just to provide some context, it's the American descendants of slaves. The major claim that's happening, there's this ongoing fight for reparations, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I think a big part of why the ADOS movement has taken off is because we're finally getting to a place where Democratic presidential candidates are being forced to say, yeah, actually, y'all do deserve some reparations. But I think an unfortunate byproduct of that is a growing movement of Black Americans who are like, our identity needs to come first. Our needs need to come first. Because we're talked over. We don't get the privileges of being an exotic kind of Black person. Like, all of those people need to go to the back, and we're first. I actually think that there was even an article in the New York Times where there's literally a quote from somebody that's like, it's time for us to come first.
Yep.
And it's like, ooh, okay, that's completely contradictory to so much of our past, of Black American folks in particular, who are like, no, we're in this together. So like, what's the way forward?
What I will say is, when America, in its efforts to move towards colorblindness, there were certain traumas, there were certain wrongs that were never righted. And so I can understand why in 2019 there is this desire to be acknowledged, to be seen. I think it's important that when we talk about slavery, that we just know our history. right? That we not oversimplify, that we understand the ways in which, actually, I believe the majority of slaves went to Brazil. The majority of Africans were taken to Brazil. After that, there was the Caribbean, and then North America and the United States. And so even though these are distinct, histories and experiences, Black people have been oppressed across the board. But I do understand it. Now, what you're kind of referring to is like the approach and the style and some of that, like you said, the xenophobia that comes out of that. And I think it's a problem. I think it's possible to assert your lineage, your heritage, and what you are owed and what you are due, without necessarily tearing down or invalidating the traumas and the oppressions of other Black people who are in the diaspora with you. So that's what I believe it is possible to do that. I don't think that it always happens.
I think people are primarily self-interested. I think something that I have realized as I've grown in my political understandings is most people are motivated by self-interest. Like, I'm out here reading these people who are unusual in the fact that their desires for equality and liberation extended far beyond themselves. And so I think that a part of organizing is understanding that that's the place where most people start.
Yes.
And then you have to go, okay, so how can we just widen it a little bit? Just a little bit. Like, how can we understand that all of our fates are linked?
Yes,
You know,
yes.
right.
And so I want to shout out Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, who is a pioneering researcher, academic, and Afro-Latina. And we were talking about the term, even Afro-Latinx has its limits, right? Right? Janelle's a different type of Black Latina than I am, right? There's so many things that kind of get oversimplified and erased. But it's useful as an organizing tool in the same way that being Black was useful as an organizing tool. So it's a matter of and this came from a conversation with Rosa Clemente, another Afro-Latina scholar. Once you say you're Afro-Latinx, what do you do with it, right? And again, this is from Rosa, so I want to make that clear. Once you say it, do you say it again just for what Kim is saying, for access and privilege and to hop in and it's cool and I'm sort of Black? Or are you organizing and advancing the rights of Black people, right? And actively calling out white supremacy and actively fighting the anti-Blackness that is embedded in the culture?
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And I also would say that within any movement, there's also going to be a need to be critical around the terminology and the experiences. And I think even what we're seeing happening now is the fact that like the term this term for a shared culture of Latinx people, Latinidad, and even the term Afro-Latinx, how far can it go, right? Because where do Afro-Indigenous folks, where do queer folks, where do able-bodied folks, where do people fit within these terms? And so while they can be used for movement building, I also think that the questioning does come into play as well. And I think that for us to have stronger movements, that's also important.
Okay, so what Natasha said really connected something for me. I want to be clear. I'm a Black American person. I have great pride in that. I don't associate with that movement. But there is an idea that I think is rallying, that is pushing people to that movement, is that there is a privilege that sometimes we can see, particularly with lighter skinned folks who identify as Black, and even immigrant folks, even Black immigrant folks, where there's a different kind of way that they can navigate society that many Black Americans don't. And so what they're talking about is a privilege that Afro-Latinx people didn't necessarily make, that Black immigrants didn't necessarily make, but they feel like they capitalize on the privilege given that white supremacy foists upon them and don't necessarily question it in a meaningful way. And so that breeds resentment among Black Americans. And so I do want to talk about the acknowledging the privilege part. So do you feel like in the Afro-Latinx community that there is a desire or a genuine acknowledgement of some of the privileges that might be able to come with having a non-Black American identity?
Well, I don't know if every Afro-Latinx person has privilege.
That's what exactly.
Really?
Because
yeah, I don't
they're the women who I met in, Loíza, Puerto Rico, who are 5 shades darker than me.
Okay.
Right? And who don't actually have this curl pattern, which gives me privilege. They have, 4C. I actually think that they don't have privilege.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'm over it. I'm listening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely don't think it's privilege. I also think that if there is this privilege, who's to blame is not the individuals or the collective. It is colonialism, colonization, white supremacy, right? Because I think back to, and I know, again, my experience is different than many other Afro-Latinx, many other Black folks, but my grandfather came to this country in the 60s, lived in Harlem. You look at that man, you don't see a difference between him and someone that was born, raised in Harlem, right? And so while he was, he didn't speak English perfectly.
Which carries another challenge, right?
Right.
That's
Which
true.
adds a
That's
challenge,
true.
Right?
Because being American is a privilege
It
when
is
you
a
go
privilege.
into other
Right.
contexts.
Right. Passport privilege, right? Like many people in Latin America, and that's a whole nother conversation. But at the end of the day, I think that in certain social spaces, can it be perceived as a privilege? Yes. And I think I know what you're getting at. I think like in terms of if we want to go there with like dating or some of those other things. However, but when we look at it like in terms of like structural privilege, I don't think that exists, because even when we look at immigration, immigrants coming here, the likelihood of like disadvantagement, like media representation, we're not seeing Black immigrants in that fight. And so I think maybe it's the use of the word privilege that I know I'm personally like, but for me,
You don't think that there is that, like, when I was in college, like, people would be like, I'm just regular Black, right? You don't think that, like, there is a perception that, like, just being like a regular Black person, that there's like stigmas attached to that, like Black American culture is deficient, or that we're lazy, we don't care about education, like all of those stigmas that if you have another kind of Black identity, that you are not attached to those kinds of particular stigmas?
I think there's stigma. I'm just weary of painting Afro-Latinx with a broad brush and saying that the whole group has privilege because of how different you can be within that term, right?
Right.
And so, again, like Janelle was saying, you may not be associated with the African American stereotypes, but when people say, "Oh, you can't you speak English?" and you're Black, and they think that all you can do is be a janitor. I mean, there's so many stories like that.
That's true.
And so I feel for my Afro-Latinx brothers and sisters who just get erased in so many ways. They're erased even in these conversations about being Latinx and their struggle. And in Puerto Rico, the poorest areas on the island consist of Black Latinos who are not given jobs. Their areas are not rebuilt after Hurricane Maria, in the same way that we have our struggles here in the U.S. Maybe not the exact same way, but just kind of these parallel struggles. So I hear you. I'm fighting for those people to be seen before I say they're privileged,
Absolutely. And I think even the fight around land rights, although we see that in terms of gentrification here, like I think in Honduras, being Garifuna, being that Afro-Indigenous group, like people are getting murdered simply for being Black and existing. And so, yeah, I know we're speaking to the U.S. context, but the term privilege, yeah.
Okay. You mentioned immigrants, and I think so often these horrible things that are happening to immigrants in the Trump administration, and even before that, we don't imagine that as being a Black folks issue. And so can you talk a little bit more about the intersection between immigration rights and Black folks and Black people? Not necessarily Black Americans, but the tons of other Black groups in this country.
Some of the research that I did in Puerto Rico was actually around racism and prejudice against Dominicans who come to Puerto Rico, because Dominicans are often perceived and expected to be darker skinned. And so they speak with a little bit of a different Spanish accent, people think. And so police in one case had reported Dominican immigrants to ICE and were getting them deported.
Oh, that's interesting.
From Puerto Rico, right? So it's like this, the oppression, like it just kind of, it transforms, and people, they mimic and they repeat, right? In the same ways that you're oppressed and Donald Trump is throwing paper towels at you and treating you like you're not actually an American citizen, you have cases and instances of some Puerto Ricans targeting Dominicans because they think that, you know, that they show up as black. So that's an example of immigration and the connection to Afro-Latinx.
Yeah, and I also think the story, especially what media is portraying, what's happening, you know, specifically immigrants coming from Central America, primarily like El Salvador and Honduras, a large percentage are black. And it's not just those two countries, it's also, it's many other Latin American countries, but media does a really great job of like the face of, you know, the immigration struggle, but many people do not know that a large percentage are black people that are trying to cross over and also fleeing from femicide, fleeing from gang violence, a ton of different issues. And
lots
so
of LGBTQ violence as well.
Absolutely. And I think also when we think about our communities, a lot of, again, just being black, just from the diaspora, there's parallels. And so we can't necessarily, I know it's so hard just existing, right? And the many things individually that we have to like go through. But when we think of the collective, it's not that different. And I would just like charge people to really just be open to that and learning and educating themselves, because I've even seen and have heard and had to educate, you know, someone that's African American saying like, well, yeah, too many people are coming in. And I'm like, bruh, we are like, what?
I think, you know, something I've been trying to read up on and like explain to people is this quest to strip people of citizenship or to deny people of citizenship is not, it's very intimately connected to the Black American experience in particular, because for so long, in so many ways, our governments have tried to strip us of citizenship and the rights and privileges of citizenship, or set the boundaries of citizenship such that we are outside of them. And like, that stuff, just because Black Americans are not being targeted in a specific way by Trump's policy right now, doesn't mean that one day somebody can't wake up and be like, oh no, not you. Or even, sorry, not to go off on this, but even in like the voting rights thing, you know, the way that like these voting rights laws are set up to be like, that are, that like, it's like old Black people who like can't find their birth certificate or can't find their enlistment papers. And it's like, they're setting up those obstacles purposely to strip old Black people of the rights of citizenship. That relates to the immigrant stuff that we are seeing. It's all connected.
Absolutely. And we have seen, I forget this person's name in the specific account, but there was a gentleman that was born here. And I believe had like Caribbean descent and was brought in, right? And we have seen, it hasn't been as publicized, but we have seen one or two instances where people literally were born here, but simply because their parents were not, and paperwork may not have been in order, as you just noted, they're brought in, right? And so we're starting to see that. And like you said, the interconnections are there. What's next?
Earlier, Natasha, you talked about misrepresentation and the resentment you have that sometimes when we're talking about the Afro-Latinx thing, it's always about an Evelyn Lozada doing something crazy, or even like a Gina Rodriguez doing something crazy. So can you talk about the kind of misrepresentation of Latinx people and Afro-Latinx folks that makes y'all's lives harder?
Oh, well, yeah, I guess maybe just that when Gina Rodriguez is even held up as Afro-Latina, and we're not getting to see, again, the people who present as Black every day, who are proud of it every day, who have such a close, intimate connection to Africa because traditions that were like literally passed down, that my African-American identity is envious of, that I'm like, I wish I had this understanding of, Africa that you do. So yeah, I think those are, when you think of Afro-Latina, just don't think of only those people. Understand that there are so many of us. And again, that the term is just an umbrella term. Even within that, there's so much diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Gina is extremely problematic on a lot of fronts. And many people have tried to educate her, not just that identify similar to her, but Afro-Latinx people. I remember a thread maybe 2-3 years ago when she did the hashtag Latina Power, and everyone there was mestiza or white, excluding Rosario Dawson, who, is light-skinned. And, her then being like, oh, well, educate me sort of thing. But every year since, there has been a point where she needs to get educated.
It's like she's trolling a little bit.
Absolutely. But it's also, the sad part is that we, in our communities, know individuals that fall into that same thing, right? Or tactic, where it's like, oh, because I am, I can kind of have one foot into what you were saying earlier, one foot in, one foot out. But that should never be like her. The situation with Sin, the situation with Evelyn should not be held to a place of that's what Afro-Latina or Afro-Latinx conversations are. Those are some of these things that bubble up through social media. And while it's such a great tool for us to have conversations, people can definitely look at hashtags Afro-Latina to see people doing the work, people having the hard conversations and questioning not just things within our own community, but outside of that as well. But yeah, that girl is not someone that we claim.
I swear I heard her one day said, look at my dad. And so I thought she was saying that
her father is not even Afro-Latinx anything.
Oh!
He is
not even close.
Actually, could be maybe considered, or does he have indigenous background there possibly, but she used that as anyone who's trying to prove a point when they know that the point is not there. Her dad is definitely not Afro-Latinx, and so
is this a revelation? Kim's like, wait,
I saw it.
Yeah.
Well, then she is really problematic.
Yeah.
So
she gets dragged regularly within.
Absolutely.
Well, that seems like she's intentionally misleading people then.
Absolutely.
Whoa. Okay. Well, that's worse than I thought. So that's all I really had. Thank you guys so much for taking some time to talk to me. Things were clarified for me, so I'm sure that things are clarified for the audience. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Like, share, and subscribe. Sign up for the Patreon. We're going to do a real quick after show over on the Patreon. So if you want a little bit more of Natasha and Janelle, head on over there. Send me an email. Hit me up on Twitter and Instagram. That's all I got. Bye, guys.